Hi, everyone, and welcome to this final episode of Living an Awakened Life with me, Susan Telford. I'm delighted to say that my guest today is Angelo DeLulo. Hi, Angelo, it's lovely to meet you.
Hello, Susan. Nice to meet you as well.
I've been following your YouTube channel for quite some time, and I think I've told you it's been mentioned to you that your book, Awake, It's Your Turn, is our current study in our Evolve book group. Really enjoying the book. We're going at a snail's pace, I have to say. There's so much in the book. We're going really, really slowly. So, for those of you that have not heard of Angelo or not familiar with Angelo's work, let me just read you his bio, and then I'd like to have a conversation starting off with that bio, if that's okay, Angelo.
Yeah.
So, at the age of 24, after years of intense internal suffering, and an intuition that something about the way we interact with our thoughts causes a lot of unnecessary suffering, Angelo had a fundamental shift in the way he experiences reality. This was a pervasive transformation and was life altering at every level. It suddenly became clear that thoughts and the way they paint our experience of ourselves, time, and space are essentially unreal, something like ghosts. What replaced this world of thought, struggle, and suffering was boundless clarity and intimacy with all immediate textures of phenomena. It became clear that this is simply the natural state of things and that it's true for everyone, even when veiled by thought. So Angelo has a YouTube channel which is called Simply Always Awake, a website of the same name, simplyalwaysawake.com, and as I said, has written a wonderful book called Awake, It's Your Turn. And I'd actually just listened to your Back Gap interview yesterday, and I think that was a year or so ago, and you said you were writing another book, so I wanted to ask you what the progress is on that.
Oh my
Is
goodness.
any publication date imminent?
No, it'll be
No.
a while. It'll be a while. Yeah.
Yeah.
hmm
Okay.
These things come on their own time,
Okay.
I can sense that it will come to fruition, but like the first book, it took years. It was just sort of something I felt coming, and then it started to form into more writing, and then it became voluminous writing and restructuring and rewriting and editing because I wanted to get it very precise. So it was quite a process the first time. This one won't be as big because it won't require as much content, but it's going to be a while.
Yeah. Well, we look forward to it when it does come. So as I said, the theme of this podcast segment that I do is living an awakened life, and your channel is called Simply Always Awake. So I thought a good place to start would be, what do we mean by awake? What does it mean to be awakened?
Hmm. Yeah, that's such a great question, isn't it? It never gets old for me, the question, because in this moment there's always freshness. In this moment there's always newness. Always, it's pristinely alive, and it's coming from I don't know where. It's as a mystery arising. Let's say this moment. That's how it feels all the time. And from this, anything can happen. Anything can appear. Anything can be spoken. But when there's not identity or false identity, when there's not a lot of thought and struggle in the mental space in the way of it, then the best way I can say it is you're in synchronicity with that clarity. You're in synchronicity with that peace and freedom of this moment. And when there's that synchronicity, then things just appear as they need to. They appear as they should, in a sense. They appear pristinely and innocently and so beautifully and so perfectly. That's how it feels. That's the feel of it. So what it means is that to be awake is to not have that mass of false identity in the way, not to have that mass of thought in the way, not to have that mass of doubt, mental It's very mental, the doubt, not to have that in the way, the sense of seeking, always trying to find something better to to make yourself feel better without realizing that's what you're doing, which is reinforcing a sense of lack. When that's not in the way, the awakeness is just revealed very naturally. So again, it's already here. The awakeness is already here. The pristine clarity is already here always. It's the case with everyone. It's really just a matter of how much buy-in we have to that identity structure, to that doubt structure of the mind, how to the thoughts that are pretty incessant, until they're not. And the more buy-in we have there, the more, I could just call it distracted our attention is into this sort of small internal space that feels separate from everything, including the world out there. The less buy-in we have, the less interest we have in that false world, and the more we actually experience reality unfiltered, or I could say reality unconditioned by the mind, unconditioned by delusion, which turns out to be in every respect beyond the capabilities of the mind, which is very odd. One of the concerns we often have as we're engaging this process, or we're waking up, is, well, if I don't have thoughts, how will I accomplish this and that? How will I make things happen? How will I have goals? How will I get what I want? How will I figure things out? How will I solve problems? It turns out that the thoughts were never doing any of that. The thoughts are a reflection of the natural, we could just say, intelligent apparatus that's already doing that. It's already happening. It's already spontaneously appearing. And that's the huge, huge relief that comes with a shift in identity, that what we call first awakening. The huge relief is, I don't have to do all that. I've been holding myself to the iron so intensely. I've been holding myself to these standards that are, hobbled together by beliefs that I've gotten from other people, from society, from media, for God's sake, from advertising, from wherever, hobbled together these ideas about how I should be, how I should think about myself, how I should judge myself, how I should compare myself. I've been doing it all day long. And all of a sudden I realize I don't need to do any of it at all to feel deeply settled. That's a huge relief. And all of a sudden attention is just freed up, and it rediscovers this place that is naturally unconditioned, but vast. And it has a very different feel to it. The instinctual feel is very different. And what I mean by that is, I'll have to make comparisons. The mind feels confined. The seeking mind feels unrested. The analyzing and judging mind feels doubtful and small. This doesn't concern itself with any of that. It has no concern with conceptual reality. It feels vast. It feels infinite, rather infinite, infinite in every dimension. It also feels intimate. So it's paradoxical, because vastness could be imagined as space, or some vast space. It's not really like that. There's a vastness and an infinite feel to it, but there's also an eternal experience. Eternal means not in time, so not bound by time. The sense of past and future are just not here. And with that, it's as if everything collapses into this exact experience, such that every sound, every sensation, every movement of the body is the entirety of the cosmos. That sounds very grandiose, but it's also very simple and obvious. It's just that way. So it's kind of the best of all worlds in a sense. That sounds great if I say it that way, but the important message I want to get across to anyone who's listening is, it does take some unbinding. It takes some traversing of the shadow, a significant amount of traversing of the shadow and emotion, and seeing things in yourself you didn't know were there, and exploring aspects of your identity that you may not want to look at. Other aspects are nice to let go of. Some aspects you may not want to let go of, or you just may not want to see. And so this whole thing I'm talking about requires a very thorough exploration, a completely thorough exploration of everything you take yourself to be, which is quite a beautiful thing. It's the ultimate journey. It's the inward journey. But just know that it's not always comfortable. It's not here to give you everything you think you want, because if you really had everything you thought you wanted, you'd probably be miserable. It doesn't necessarily function the way It doesn't function by the rule set that the mind might think it should function by. Your expectations are very limited. Expectations and our paradigms of the way the world functions are very limited. This is not limited. This is infinite. So we'll go beyond your paradigms, and that can feel challenging in various ways. So that's my overall spiel about what awake means.
I imagine that for someone who has had a taste of this, they're nodding their head, going, yeah, yeah, I get this, I get this. For someone who is just beginning to explore these matters, you know, um, has maybe seen one of your videos on YouTube, or has maybe heard of a teacher or a book or something, but really doesn't have that experiential knowing of what it is to be awake. If they come to you and say, okay, Angelo, I hear you're saying that everyone is awake, simply always awake, yeah. But I don't feel awake.
Mhm.
I am not touching any of these things that you're saying. Where do I begin? What's my entry point? How do I approach this?
Mm.
What would you say to them right back at that first interest point?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Perfect. I love to actually speak to that audience, because anytime we do anything online, anytime we put it out there on YouTube or put it on a podcast, there are going to be people who bump into this and may have heard of this, never have heard of this at all. This may be the first time they've ever heard any of this kind of speaking and so forth. It's going to happen, and that's great.
Every time I do a podcast, I always imagine a listener
Mhm.
who has almost by accident tuned into this and doesn't know what we're talking about, and that's the person that I really want to be speaking to. So yeah.
Well, my heart is with you there. That's what the whole book is written in that way, right? So yeah, if someone's listening to this and they hear everything I just said and say, that sounds really cool, but I don't have any personal experience of that. Also, I don't know if I understand what spirituality is. I'm not even sure if I'm interested in it. What are you talking about, right? I would just say to that person, I have good news for you. And the good news is this: you don't have to know anything that I'm talking about. It doesn't have to register as making sense to the mind. And actually, it's common when you first come into contact with this that the mind is going, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. Wait, that sounds cool, but wait, it doesn't make sense. And a lot of doubt comes up. Don't worry about it. It doesn't matter. And the other thing I'll say is, if it feels like, why don't I sense this? Other people seem to be talking about it, but I don't have that sense of it. Why is that? Don't worry about that. The fact that you're even somewhat interested in this says a lot. If you haven't turned this off by now, some part of you knows something. There's an attunement, kind of like maybe a needle that points to the North Pole on a compass or something. You don't feel those gravitational forces, but the needle does. There's something in you that's quite like that. So it's okay. You don't have to understand this. You don't have to get your head around it. You don't have to learn anything specific, and you don't have to join any certain kind of group or group think. You don't have to think a certain way, and you don't have to start to think a certain way for this to happen. Not at all. Anyone can access what I'm talking about, and the way it's going to happen for them will be reasonably personal. So you can look out and see me speaking about this and see another person speaking about some other version of this, and then another, and you can see all these people and go, well, why do they have that I don't? Well, part of the answer is because you think it's something they have. You're looking outward still a little bit. And we're really trained to do this from a very young age. We're trained to focus on the outward, focus on other people, focus on our parents, focus on authority figures, focus on groups. And it's for our safety and it's for our fitting in. We're very, very wired to do this. What I'm saying here is I'm just giving you permission in the most basic way possible, or telling you can give yourself permission to look inward. It's simply about looking inward. It's not about being smart, intelligent, knowing about spiritual concepts. It's really not about any of that. It's about looking inward in a certain way. It's about touching into something that's been there the whole time. But you may have actually learned to overlook it because you've been looking outward, because you've been taking your cues from other people. And I'm saying you don't have to keep doing that. For this subject I'm talking about, what we're really talking about is going back into your instinct. going back into something you've been carrying around the whole time, because everyone does. It's in you. It's there. So what I would say is this. If this is a total turnoff to you, if something in you is like, no, I'm not ready right now, or I'm just not interested, that's fine. Trust that. Go do whatever you want to do, and maybe it'll become interesting later. And sometimes it does. If you're in the second category, which is like, I'm interested, but again, I've never had a taste of this, I'm not really sure what we're talking about here, that's fine. Just let this message, just feel into it. Just let it sort of settle down into you a little bit. Don't worry about trying to read a bunch about it right now and understand, and just really try to feel into what I'm saying and see if it doesn't, just a very subtle glimmer somewhere inside of you that's just saying kind of like, yes, I think there's something here. And it won't feel like what I'm talking about necessarily. It'll feel like you. It'll feel like something intimate. It'll feel like something very fundamental to who and what you are before you even learned about who or what you are. That's where I'm pointing you always. It's just something inside. It just feels a certain way. And the way it feels is like, I don't have to do anything to make this better. I don't have to do anything to fix this. It's already just the way it is. And it's just fine. It's just fine the way it is. When you were a young child, you knew this. At some point as a child, you knew you were just okay, because you didn't think about being okay or not okay. You were playing, or you were in presence, or you were just innocent. At some age, even children who are traumatized, at some age going back, almost all of them have had periods where they were just in presence and they felt generally okay, not trying to be something, not trying to be someone, not trying to figure life out, but just a general feeling of okayness. That's essentially what I'm pointing to start, is just that there's something in you that you've been carrying around the whole time that you may have learned to overlook a little bit in the way you function, the way you interact with other people. And I'm really just pointing you back to it. I'm saying, hey, just touch into that. Just taste it, or get curious about it. Another thing that can get people that first taste, that maybe recognition is what I would call it, which you're asking about, because some people here have that for sure, and other people have had shifts in identity and all kinds of things that are watching, but some have had that taste but hasn't gone beyond that. That taste I often call recognition, where something really does feel beyond the usual. It's like very obvious, undeniable, and you can't really forget it. That's maybe what I would call recognition. And I would tell anybody who's listening, who's kind of new to this, that that could come at any time, and it comes out of nowhere. You may forget about this conversation. 2 weeks later, all of a sudden you're sitting there, you're staring out at the meadow, or just sitting quietly in the morning or something, and boom, you feel it. The words come back, you remember what we're talking about, and something just goes deep inside, or you feel a deep, deep, deep calmness, and it starts to open something. That's how this works. It sneaks up on you, and it's not intellectual, and it's not cognitive, and you don't have to understand anything. It's really, really instinctual. So that's what I would tell somebody who is interested at some level, but it really doesn't have that experiential sense of what we're talking about. Don't worry about it. It will come.
Yeah. So I liked what you said in your bio, that there was something about the way we interact with our thoughts that causes a lot of unnecessary suffering.
Hmm.
So how was that for you?
Hmm.
How did that come about in your life?
Yeah, well, for me, it was interesting because I actually knew this as a child. There were times when I can think back to being, I don't know, 6 or 7 years old. I don't remember the exact age, but I remember noticing the thoughts coming. It seemed like they were coming faster or more solidly than they had before or something. And I would follow them. I would notice, well, there's one thought, and then it leads to this next thought, and it leads to this next thought. And it felt uncomfortable, like it was enclosing, like it was binding me somehow. I didn't have those words, of course, but I did notice it at times when I was a child. I also noticed it was uncomfortable, but I also noticed that it sort of took me. It sort of started to carry me in a way. I don't know how else to explain that. It carried me as the thoughts. Like I started to become identified with the thoughts, or maybe I already was identified with them, but it was not a solid identity yet. And there was gaps in it, and there was presence, and then there was thoughts, and I was noticing that. But I did notice I started to become enticed by the thoughts, especially the thoughts that were, we'll just use the term negative, like doubt thoughts about, oh gosh, I better not do that, or I better not say that, or oh, I don't want to make mom or dad mad because of this or that. Those kinds of thoughts were actually more binding, more sticky. And I noticed that, I think, when I was young. But at some point, I just got so hypnotized by those thoughts that I thought I was those thoughts, I suppose. I found myself as a sort of, I don't know, young teenager to older teenager. It got worse and worse, where I found myself just bound into this world of thoughts. And it was so uncomfortable. It felt very, very uncomfortable for me. It's different for everybody. I think some people might call it anxiety, but for me, it was anxiety, but it was so pervasive and intense. It was like a problem I had to solve now, but I couldn't solve it. And I was trying to solve it with thought. That was the weird thing. I was trying to think my way out of the problem of thinking, and I knew that wasn't working, but somehow I just kept trying, and it just felt really suffocating. It felt very enclosing to me, and it was definitely about thoughts. But I didn't know. I suppose I didn't know there was a way beyond thought. I didn't realize there was like a way to sort of break that spell. And instinctually, I didn't feel like there was anything available like in psychology. There may be for some people for anxiety and things like that. I don't discount that. But for me, my instinct was like, no, that's not quite it. There's something, I need something more, something bigger, because this is such a pervasive experience for me. And I found it when I was 24. I read in a book about Zen. Actually, one of the Zen teachers said, thinking is the illness of the human mind, or thinking is the disease of the human mind. And it really struck me. I thought, oh my goodness, wow. And he just said it so clearly. And it was so obvious to me at that moment that that's exactly what the problem was, for me at least. And what was so interesting is, I think I was surprised that I read a statement so clear and so simple, and I had never really heard that. Like, why isn't anyone talking about this? I felt very alone in all this too. Like I was carrying around a secret, and I'm like, not sure if everybody else is carrying that same secret, but a lot of people do seem to be suffering. I felt like I was suffering more than most, maybe, but I still think a lot of people around me were suffering. And it was obvious they weren't talking about it. It was obvious people weren't really talking about the real issue, like the elephant in the room. The analogy I made in my book is, no one pulled you aside when you're a child and said, hey, by the time you're a young adult, you're going to have a companion with you all the time. It's going to be talking to you all the time. It's going to know you better than anyone that knows any of your parents, your children, your lover. It's going to be telling you things all the time. It's going to be telling you bad things. It's going to be telling you you're not good enough. And it's going to be constantly talking in your ear all day long. No one told me that, but that's what my thoughts did. That's what my thoughts became, essentially. And so, in retrospect, I look at it and I'm like, wow, we don't talk about it. There's something about shame, and there's something about thoughts that feels so hidden, but the hiddenness, strangely enough, is part of the mechanism that keeps it going. There's some part of ourself we don't want to look at. So this is why an investigation of thought and the nature of thought and binding into thought and identity will lead you pretty quickly into the shadow, into the emotion work. Because at some point you'll start to really feeling, well, why in the heck do I feel so bound into these thoughts? Why do I feel like a thought that says I'm not good enough is real? Why do I respond to that thought? Why does that thought define my behavior even? It's a thought, right? The reason is we have to start to go into the emotion body to find the answer. And things like shame will come into contact with things like shame, or emotions and experiences like shame, guilt, resentment, and all this. So yeah, that was my entry point, though, was thought, for sure. And the book I was reading, it was a Zen book, and they use a very, very simple and direct approach to break that spell. It's a koan, basically. And the idea is to unify the mind, the concentration, so much around something that's not a thought, that's not a concept. They use something very, very simple. It's simply a word, mu. That's it. But you unify your concentration so much around that you don't, it's like as if you don't allow thoughts anymore somehow, or you don't, I should say you don't entertain them. You don't push them away. You're not struggling with thoughts, but you're just unifying the mind so much that the mind actually does become calm. And if it becomes calm enough, you actually start to experience shifts in identity. And it's pretty well laid out in Zen, and they've been doing it for hundreds of years. That's not the only way to do it. There's many ways to do it. And the way when I work with people that I sort of guide them toward depends on the person. And I don't always use something like that. Sometimes I do, but often it's more like instinctual. It's more of like a letting go, or surrendering to your immediate experience without conceptualizing your immediate experience. There's a lot of ways to to break that initial spell, the spell of identification with thought. But ultimately, it's about identification with thought, identifying with all this collection of thoughts that I'll say tells us, because we think we're the thinker, but it's actually just thoughts, and they're telling us you're not good enough, you need to do more of this, you doubt that, oh, I'm not sure about this, I'm not sure if I'm capable of that, I'm not sure if I'm worthy of this, on and on and on and on. And that we actually become identified with it, meaning it feels like who we are after a while. And I had no idea how much I had identified with that. I knew I had, but I had no idea how much I had until the tether was cut. When the shift happened, it was literally like a physical change. It wasn't just a mental change. It was physical. It was emotional and energetic and physical. And it was huge. And that was the biggest relief I've ever experienced in this lifetime.
Yeah, it's exhausting,
Mm-hmm.
maintaining that thought constructed identity.
Mm-hmm.
There's not even any questioning of it. That something seems to happen. Some I don't know what it is. For some people, it's suffering, or for other people, it can be a sudden insight, or for me, it was burnout.
Mm-hmm.
A high school teacher, and I had a really bad burnout, which put me in bed for 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't find a way. I couldn't see a way to live my life in any other way than I had before. And that led to the discovery that I had constructed a whole life, a whole personality, a whole way of being around this. You're only loved if you excel. That was the nugget of it. There were lots of other things all around that, but that was the nugget. And I had driven myself so hard in service to that believed thought that I ended up in a state of collapse.
Mm-hmm.
And seeing that, oh my God, I made that all up. Or I believed it, I took it and I thought it was me. That's what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah,
I thought that was me. It's not me.
that's
Not who
right.
I am.
Yeah, exactly. And what's interesting is often, not always, but often when we really take up this investigation, however we do it, sometimes we're not even, it's not necessarily by choice. We just get put in bed. I mean, I've heard that sort of thing before as well. But at some point, we often find this like sentinel belief. There's like one belief that is kind of at the core of a network of other beliefs, or doubts or self-judgments or whatever. And I've experienced that before as well, where all of a sudden you see that last belief drop and there's nothing left. There's no more beliefs you're identifying with, and then you're in this sort of free fall, but it's a really wonderful free fall.
Yeah. It was like the keystone in a bridge.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that stone was taken away, the structure fell.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. It's so beautiful.
But you've mentioned shadow work. That wasn't the end of it. And I think that's sometimes a misconception, that we have these glimpses, we have these awakenings, and then it's all just peace and bliss and wonder.
Yeah.
So speak about that, because I feel that's such an important topic for people, because otherwise people say things like, I had an awakening and I lost it.
Mm-hmm.
And then spend all their time trying to get back to what they had felt.
Mm-hmm.
I think that kind of plays into this notion as well of awakening experiences.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of not an experience. So
Mm-hmm.
can you speak to those two things, the necessity for shadow work and the fact that this is not an experience, because an experience comes and goes.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll answer the second part first, and that is exactly right. Awakening is not an experience, and this is not to discount experiences. We can have mystical experiences. I'll define mystical experience as beyond the usual confines of the normal sort of parameters or bandwidth of what we experience on a day-to-day basis. It goes way beyond that. And it's often something that feels either very timeless, beyond time, or something that feels very intimate. I'll say like a sense of universal love or universal connection. These are mystical experiences, and those do happen to people. And they are a sort of, I sometimes call it a pre-taste of awakening. But to define an experience, I would say it this way: There's an identity structure or a person, and that person is moving along in the usual experiences, and then they have this blown open experience, this mystical experience, and then they come out the other side and they're the same person, but now they have an experience to talk about or try to get back to or tell their friends about or try to repeat. And that's fine. It's all good, but that's not awakening. Awakening is when the identity, the person that thinks they're this way, suddenly finds out they're actually not that at all. That's just not what you thought you were, is not at all what you are. You may not even, you usually won't know what you are beyond that, but you also don't feel like you need to. You're not defining yourself by thoughts and concepts anymore. And that's one of the huge aspects of the relief. So a shift in identity really is the key to awakening. And people do get these sort of pre-tastes of awakening, often leading up to awakening. But the critical point is awakening itself. It's nothing experiential. And the insight is obvious and it's not reversible. And one benefit of knowing that is that when after awakening, you start to have different kinds of experiences, meaning intense emotional experiences, you start to feel things in a more direct way than you ever did, including fear and including emotional, resistance patterns that you didn't even know you had. And now you can see, oh, I'm actually resisting emotions. What is that about? I'm repressing emotion. And you can see it actively happening, which is wonderful because that won't unbind unless it comes into consciousness, essentially. But the fact that you actually know that that's not to do with identity, that's an experience. And those experiences will come and go. Everything comes and goes in the experiential realm. And so that's really helpful to know that, I think, ahead of time. The second part about emotion work, shadow work. Man, I agree with you that that's something that's often overlooked. I'll even make a broader statement that the ways in which spirituality can go, spirituality in the broad sense, spiritual groups, spiritual organizations, spiritual traditions, the ways in which they go wrong has exactly to do with this. And in large scales, in very large scales, in really tragic scales, and tragic, things happening, as well as small scales and in individuals, what goes wrong is exactly this. It's not understanding and not being willing to engage the shadow in the way that you're called to do, and not understanding that that's part of the process, because you can start to try to really bypass things here. Partially because you do have an expanded sense of identity. You can identify with consciousness. I am consciousness. I am being. I am infinite, whatever. But you're still identifying with something, and that identity, that tendency to sort of reify one aspect of experience, is actually overlooking another very important aspect of experience. And in fact, the aspect of experience that's knocking on your door. And it will come knocking on your door after awakening. My Zen teacher used to say, your ego doesn't take awakening lying down. For a while, you'll feel like you don't have an ego. You'll feel like it's gone, but it's not gone. It comes back, and it comes back with fire. And that's okay, because now you have much more bandwidth. You have essentially infinite bandwidth because you have infinite consciousness, and you're aware of the infinite nature of presence itself. You have much more bandwidth to work through this stuff, but you have to work through it. You have to be willing. And the keys to this, in my opinion, in my experience, I'll just summarize: willingness, humility, having a teacher of some kind of someone who can hold you to keep you from your own BS, who is an objective, but clear person who can show you where you're maybe bypassing or you're lying to yourself. So at every level of realization, I recommend someone having some kind of teacher or mentor. I feel like I have many mentors and teachers. I interact with people all the time, and I'm always open to anything they see or reflect on back to me. What happens that becomes problematic is when someone has maybe an initial awakening, but really avoids that shadow. And there's a certain personality type that's set up for this, I think, but then they silo off. They keep everyone away from them, and then they get a small enough group of people that are all convinced they're the most enlightened person in the world. Then you get a cult. And, I don't know if we talk about cults on this podcast, but I think it's important to talk about it because they still happen right now. In this day and age, we have cults. Like, it's insane, but we do. And there's very good documentaries on them, the Nexium cult, and then there was the Twin Flames cult. These are on Netflix. There's all kinds of stuff you can look at, but that does happen. And it's important to understand this because all of us have certain tendencies of personality that we'll have to explore, that we would see, oh, okay, I can see how I might buy into that. I might buy into the enlightened teacher where I don't have to do the work because they are the enlightened one and I can just kind of stand in their glow, right? You can't do that. You have to take on the responsibility yourself. Vice versa, if you don't want to try to be the most enlightened person in the world and get all the validation out of everybody around you that you always thought you needed, that's not the right way to address the shadow either. So, exploring all of these ways that the human personality can hit dead ends in a way, or can find itself in unfortunate situations is helpful, and it's important to know that and see it in yourself. And that's called vulnerability, to see like, wow, yeah, I do have fear. Wow, yeah, I do have jealousy. Yeah, I do have competitiveness. I do, if you don't see those things in yourself, they may be operating you. They may be running you, and that's what shadow work is. It's just really honest, taking a look inside, seeing how all the different situations you'll come into contact with in life will bring forth the conditions to feel different emotions. All of them, the whole bandwidth you're going to experience at some point, and it's important to, like I said, the deep ones are resentment, guilt, shame. These are often so deep in the shadow we don't even realize they're running the show, but they are. And fear, pervasive psychological fear, including the fear of helplessness. You have to actually navigate this territory in a vulnerable and honest way, to the point where you can feel it fully and feel it directly and actually truly embody it. We use the word embodiment a lot. It's maybe an overly used word, but at some point you really embody it, meaning the sensation field that is at the core of every emotion is all that you really need to experience. But you have to experience it, without resistance, without intellectualization, without avoidance, without trying to heal it, like just really fully embodying the full bandwidth of emotion. And everyone can do this. We're just really taught not to. So this part, the shadow stuff, is where you're kind of starting to go a little bit against the grain of social conditioning, because social conditioning will tell you everything but this. It really, even though we're getting more intelligent now, we have more emotional intelligence. People are talking about these things much better. There's circling, and there's more and more and more about all of what we're talking about, which is great. Somatic modalities, it's awesome. And yet the overarching human paradigm really is around emotional avoidance, and that becomes very obvious at deeper stages of realization to people that I've encountered. Yeah.
And I think that's more prevalent in men, Angelo. Boys are kind of conditioned to, big boys don't cry, stiff
Mhm.
upper lip kind of
Yeah.
thing. I think women maybe have more facility with sharing emotions and allowing themselves emotions.
Mhm. Yeah, I would say the way I would say it is, I don't usually just break it in terms of men and women, but there are masculine and feminine energies, and at every level of the shadow, you will encounter both in various um, um, at various frequencies. I'll say, just to use a term, but the masculine energy definitely has that tendency. Feminine energy also has ways of I call it like a feminine distortion. There's masculine and feminine distortion, and feminine energy functions differently. It can function more through like um, hiding a little more, the deep, the like dark feminine, sometimes manipulation, things like that. So there are definitely spaces you'll encounter that are there are tendencies to avoid, to hide, to run, to manipulate other people, to cling. All of these energies are these energies you're going to come into contact with in the deep shadow. But I mean, I do think toxic masculinity is a thing. The sort of, I don't know, 1940s, 50s, 60s era men, maybe whose fathers came out of the Depression. I don't know, who they're just not comfortable feeling anything but anger, for instance. That's sort of stereotyped masculine. But yeah, I mean, there are personality disorders rampant in every gender, and it's more about the individual than any specific gender or location or nation, because that's what I find. I don't really, interestingly, now don't have a sense of making generalizations about male or female anymore, because in the group of people I work with, because what I see is in deeper stages of realization, everybody actually has to confront the same deep fears, and around identity structure and so forth. And it becomes very even playing field at the deeper stages. in the shadow is what I find, whether you're male, female, or anything else.
Yeah. So you've probably spoken about this already, but it was a point that I wanted to bring up. There's a sentence in your book that I really liked, and you said, "I'm not interested in you developing a new hobby called awakening."
Yeah.
Yeah. So why did you write that? What do you mean by that? And how do you know is maybe the better question. How would someone know whether they're kind of just dabbling
Oh,
that
okay.
I've got, my hobby is awakening,
I love that. That's a really good question. How would you know? Okay. And actually, it's funny. I put a lot of these statements in there, sort of targeting specific fixations and different types of people I've come into contact with, because we all fixate in all kinds of different ways. But for some people, it's more prominent in one way or another, or whatever. So, specifically is this a hobby to you? I think there's a certain mindset that I would say very intellectual. So someone who's quite intellectual and really loves the intellectual nature of what we're talking about and wants to read everything about it and reads all the books and reads the suttas and all of it. And but when you talk to them, they don't feel like they have what you mentioned earlier on, that direct insight, that direct experience. And that's unfortunate because it's available to them. I do think there's a personality type that's set up such that the intellect is kind of the space they live in, and there's a pretty profound fear that's kind of kept at bay underneath it, and that fear is kept at bay by staying in the mind, by staying in concepts. And so as long as you keep learning more, keep understanding more, you're safe, right? And that can become counterproductive when it comes to this particular thing we're talking about, because like I said, the very first shift, the first movement is a movement beyond thought, and knowledge is structured in thought, this kind of knowledge, conceptual knowledge. And so I'm really pointing at that. And so if the way you know this, if this is a hobby for you, or if this is an intellectual interest, but you haven't really gone deeper, is if you feel like you're in control. If you feel like you're in control of this, if you feel like you know everything about it, if you haven't been humbled, if you haven't been put on your knees yet by this, if you haven't felt something completely beyond you moving this and moving your life and the thing you're calling awakening in ways that you're not in control of, and very surprising and very mysterious, if you haven't felt that yet, you may be a bit in the superficial realm with this. And that's okay. It's okay. But I would say, hey, do you want to take it deeper? Do you want to kind of really dig in? And then it's a matter of, okay, well, where are you? Where are you fixating? What are you afraid of? That's usually the question I want to get to with people. Sometimes that question is too triggering even. So I might kind of keep pointing to the fact that, learning more about this isn't really going to get you anywhere, because it hasn't for 5 years, right? And they usually will understand and agree with that. So then it's like, okay, well, what happens if you let go of all your knowledge? Oh, that's kind of scary. What if you let go of all your spiritual knowledge? What if it's just gone? And it's like, ooh, that's kind of scary. It's like, yeah, that's where I want you to go. I want you to go into the fear. I want you to get down in the emotion body. That's where you need to go, because that's the polarity that's keeping this very rigid sense of conceptual identity alive, is the polarity between that conceptual identity and the fear. That's the polarity that's set up in that particular type of person. So it's like, I need you to go down to the emotion body. Or something like prayer, even like really sending a heartfelt request to the universe, to the cosmos, a true prayer, a prayer that says, I just want the truth. Whatever that does to my life, I'm okay with it. But I know I need to go beyond what I think I am. Send that kind of prayer inward, and you might be surprised what happens. And what I find is with people, I'm thinking back on a handful of people I've worked with, what often happens is they kind of sense that what I'm saying is true, but they're still afraid. And all of a sudden something will happen in their life. Like something will just shift in their life, like a disruption of some kind, an illness or breakup or job loss or something happens. And then it actually breaks that open. And then it's like, oh my God, you're right. I get that from them.
Yeah. I think in my case, that intellectual thing kind of came afterwards, because it was the playing out of that same thing, but now it took on a spiritual face.
Mhm.
So although I'd had this seeing, I wanted to get really good at it. So hence all the books.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
wanted, I investigated all these different traditions. I wanted to see, what was everything saying about it. So it's like that just, I went from being a high achiever in one field to trying to be a high achiever in the spiritual arena.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, and yeah, this and all this can happen in all different orders and different phases. And like I said, we all have all of these fixations. We all have some tendency here and there to fixate in the intellect or various things. But for some people, some aspects of these are just much stronger, and they come forward at different phases of the realization process. But what we're all going to touch into all of them, and some of them will be our big sort of barrier that we get through here or there.
Yeah. What was it for you? What would you say your biggest one was?
That's a good question. It's been a long time. Um, I mean, in some sense, for me, it was not having any, it was almost the opposite, like not having any knowledge of that spirituality was a thing, like true, intact, awakening type, you know. I just didn't know about it. I didn't know it was there. I didn't have really anyone around me when I was suffering so much. And that's why I love to do this. I love to just get it out there. But the emotion stuff is always challenging, and it's challenging for everyone because it requires such a different skill set to navigate. It requires such an intuitive, um, gentle, intuitive, uh, uh, you know, um, investigation, and it's wrought with resistance patterns. The emotion body is full of resistance patterns. When you're in the mind, when you're in concepts, especially if you're like doing something you enjoy, like say fantasizing or intellectualizing, if you're using the mind in a way that sort of feels good, often you feel like you're totally in control. You feel like, oh, I can just keep thinking and analyzing and distracting, and that's very mental. But in the shadow space, in the emotions, it's really the opposite. It's like if you go where you feel like you want to go, you're not going where you need to go. You have to feel like where you're called to go somehow. And you have to be willing to feel uncomfortable for a while, willing to go into spaces where if your mind would get a hold of it, it would say, just run away. Don't stay here. Get away, get away. So learning the difference really between emotion and thought, that's critical, especially in the deep shadow, because the deeper you go into the shadow space, the more distorting a thought can actually be. It'll say things like, this is going to kill you. You're going to go crazy. You can't handle this. And when you're in spaces where you start feeling physicality unbinding, and you will at some point, that gets very scary. The thoughts can be very scary in that space. Without the thoughts, it's not scary. It's just what's happening, and you're fine. But with the thoughts, even a little bit of thought there that says you're going to go completely insane, that's really scary in that space. So the deeper you go into the shadow or into the emotion space, which starts to become the energetic space, the more things start to change physically and energetically, and the higher the price is for buying into thoughts. I mean, there's still going to be thoughts there, but not recognizing these beliefs or thoughts that are significantly distorting in nature can have a tremendous effect on your experience. But just recognizing them and releasing them, it's like such a relief. Oh yeah, you're just free to go right back into the sensations, and the sensations are safe. They're always just fine, no matter what sensations they are. It can be the sensations at the core of shame, grief, loss, anger. It can be the core sensations of anything are safe. It's when we're up here about it that it becomes unsafe for ourselves and even others.
And I can see why, you're saying having a teacher or a guide is so important, because I think when we come up to those edges, we don't want to go there.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think I heard someone once say, stay with a teacher beyond the point where you want to leave, because that is when you have got to that edge.
Yeah.
Your mind perhaps wants you to retreat back to the comfort zone, or to the the safe space, but
Yeah.
that sense of because it can feel quite like terror,
Yes.
like yeah, yeah.
Yep. Yep. you will encounter existential terror in this process later on, usually. But
Yes.
I want to say two things about that with the teacher. Oh, actually, before you said that, you said when you come up against that edge, you may not want to go. I'll also say you may not even know that's where you're supposed to go. Sometimes we're so habituated to avoid when it comes to these emotional spaces. At some point, you start to really intuit this, though, that there isn't actually no boundary, so there is nothing to avoid, and then you just find yourself moving in wherever where you need to move energetically. But yeah, you will come up against these barriers sometimes, and if you know it's there, and it does feel like existential terror. And with the teacher, yeah, a teacher can help you through that very easily. But I want to give people a caveat, and this is just for safety. If a teacher is pushing you beyond your comfort zone, or is helping you go beyond your comfort zone, I agree with that. Unless they're being abusive, coercive, trying to get something out of you, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking
Yeah.
about your own direct experience, and they're not doing anything weird. And I just want to say that because there are unscrupulous teachers who will use that exact teaching to get people to do things they shouldn't be trying to get them to do. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So I've just got a couple more questions. One is, how much choice do you think we have in any of this? That's
Well,
something, I've been pondering for quite some time because I
it's
would not.
a hilarious question. I would say if I'm really honest, I would say zero. But but there's something so funny about this, in that a large part of the human experience, until it's not like this, is a large part of the human experience feels quite like there's agency, like you're making choices and so forth. It's not that, I'll say it this way, it's not that choices aren't made, it's just that there's no one making them. And that makes it even sound more bizarre, but that's how I experience it. So what I like to tell people is, don't worry too much about that. And because what you can do is talk yourself into things, like if you maybe have a bad habit of avoiding a certain situation, you can talk yourself into continuing to avoid it by saying, well, I don't have a choice anyway, or something. The truth is, do the best you can. Do what makes the most sense to you in life, in a practical sense. Don't worry about, well, there's no doer, there's no one here, and all that stuff. That the realization of that will dawn, usually at some point. But before it dawns, it won't look like that. You can't fool yourself about this. So that's why it's not really helpful to walk around telling people there's no one there, there's no one to wake up, there's no one. It's just not helpful, because if you have that realization, you don't need to say it. It's so obvious. There's just no point in even talking about it. And if you don't have that realization, you can't really convince yourself you do, because it's so instinctual. It's so obvious. Like the obviousness of this right now, this is all coming out of nowhere. It's just appearing out of nothing. Um, it's not even appearing, actually. It's not even arising. It's just this. But it's so hard to talk about. So I can talk like that, but if someone doesn't have that experience, I would not encourage them to adopt that belief. Just move on.
And so the next question I wanted to ask you was, does it ever end? Does this ever end?
Well,
I mean, are you ever done?
you might be surprised when I say there are two answers to the question. In one sense, there is a very distinct and definite end to something in this, and I would be remiss if I didn't say that. The identity structure, the sense of taking, the sense of there being an identity, actually comes to a complete end in my experience and many people I know. That's very deep stage realization. Many people have woken up that did not realize that, and that's okay. They don't have to. They may later. That can definitely happen, and it's very, very obvious, and it's endless. You can't forget about it for 1 second. Once that's not there, it's the most obvious thing in the world. And there's a finite, definitely a finite nature to that seeking aspect, maybe, or to the identity moving through awakening aspect. Now, after that, which is weird to even talk about, because after that means there's no sense of time anymore. There's no sense of space, because there's no one to whom that refers. But these appearances are occurring. So that's just what's happening. From this space, there's no need to divide reality into absolute and relative. So the relative truth of Angelo moving through life is very easy to navigate. I don't need to deny it. There's no need to deny it. I can use terms like I and me. There's nothing behind it, but I can use those terms. It's fine. So then there becomes a very nice meeting of relative and absolute. And in the relative sense, the character, the person, the life, this, whatever this is, I find that it does clarify more and more and more. But it's hard to explain why and how that is. I would just say that the fundamental agent that causes delusion is gone, but the delusive forces and momentum and behaviors and thought patterns can still be there for a while, and really they just get subtler and subtler and subtler. So after that, what happens is, instead of spirituality moving from a place of seeming doership or effort, it moves from a place of spontaneity. Now that's a major shift, and from that spontaneity, everything is unbound, and the unbinding will continue in the relative for the rest of the lifetime of this person, and that's very obvious. But what it does is just get subtler. And then the other thing I would say is, after that, I think I'll just quote Adyashanti in saying that, there's not much left to do but become a benevolent presence in the world. What else are you going to do? There's nothing else even makes sense anymore. I could go sit and meditate for the rest of my life and be perfectly content. I don't need to do anything. But it makes, in one sense, it sort of makes more sense to do something to ease the suffering of humanity. And then we get into, like, Buddhism talks about the bodhisattva vows and things like that, which kind of makes sense. You do see the massive suffering around you. You don't stop seeing it, even if you don't personally suffer. So that's where I find myself, or that's where we find ourselves, is where I have a deep respect for the forces of delusion. And I can always learn. I can always see more subtle ways that things can be navigated in life, more subtly clear, more subtle ways in which clarity can be elucidated in everything, in ways I interact with people on a moment-to-moment basis, in partnerships, in relationships, in work, in physicality, in the way I move and how I spend my time. Like, all of that stuff continues to sort of evolve in some sense for the character, for the relative aspect of this lifetime. But there, like I said, there's also an always on, always obvious knowing of what's not actually here, and that makes all the difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love how you said being a benevolent presence in the world, because sometimes we can hear things from people who say things like, the world's an illusion, and so I don't listen to the news and I don't engage in the world, and it's always kind of struck me that that the awake ones, that doesn't make sense, but you know what I mean, um, are the ones with access to some form of benevolent action, some inspired action that could alleviate suffering, and that in the almost splitting off, and I'm not going to be involved in the world because of my spiritual realization, that something is being missed or lost, or abandoned. I mean, is
Yeah, I would say I mean, I tend to agree with you. I tend toward that kind of agreement and being engaged and so forth. But I will tell anyone listening, that to continue the unbinding process in yourself is the best act of compassion you can ever do. And that's true. And I can't tell anyone where that's going to require them to go. It may require them to go into monastic life, and I can't judge that, because
yeah,
I know that that's still the most benevolent thing they can really do, is to continue to wake up, continue to unbind. But at some point, yeah, it has to come back into, this. And that's my opinion. And I agree with you.
yeah. Ramana Maharshi said that, didn't he? Your own self realization is the greatest service you can render the world.
Yes, absolutely.
But you said at some point you come back. Do you have a sense of that there's almost a, in some traditions there's this concept of the inward facing path, where where we realize the self, and
Mhm.
then with that understanding we go back to the world. Do you have that sense of
Yeah,
of
I
self?
do. Yeah, I do. But the thing about that is, I think people maybe try to do it too early.
Yeah.
That, because like I say, an initial awakening is a huge shift, but it's really the beginning. It's really the beginning of the unbinding process. At the end of the unbinding process, which there, like I said, there's a finite end to that. Um, you do find yourself in this place of non-doership. It's like you don't really, you can imagine you have choices about what I should do or shouldn't do, but it doesn't really play out like that. For me, I didn't talk about spirituality for a handful of years, 15 years or so at all, literally at all. It just didn't even cross my mind to talk about it. And so that's how weird this is. So you're at the hands of forces completely beyond the human dimension and anything that human thinks is important, actually. And then at some point, yeah, it just came back around and it's like, okay, it's time to start talking about this. And I did. There were circumstances that kind of led up to it, but generally speaking, seemed to kind of come out of the blue, but it makes a lot of sense now. And that those 15 years make a heck of a lot of sense in retrospect. It took me a long time to digest it well enough to where I would trust myself to talk about it, because there's a lot of ways to talk about it that are confusing to people. And, so what I recommend to people is just keep waking up, like really, and then the people I do know who have, kind of crossed that final identity barrier, I find that they tend toward working with people. They tend toward helping others. But there's a pitfall in spirituality too, and it has to do with when you look at a spiritual teacher and you go, oh, they get so much validation, they get so much love. And so I think sometimes people want to be spiritual teachers a little too early. And again, unscrupulous people can do it and, really manipulate people and things like that. So I'm more inclined to say, just keep waking up. If you have a strong urge to like put yourself in a position to teach people and wake people up, that's maybe not the right motivation. You know what I mean? Like most of the people, almost everyone pretty much that I know that I would recommend to facilitate, they came to a place where they were like, I'm not sure I would want to do that. That's where I want you to be, right? Because you realize the gravity of what you're engaged in. You realize how easy this is to delude yourself. You realize how easy it is to confuse people, and you have that really, really deep understanding. That's when I actually trust somebody. So I think people try to take that full circle maybe too early sometimes for personal reasons, in a way. And but it's hard because it's a case by case basis. So it's hard to make broad general statements about it. But at some point, yeah, it's got to come back around to compassion.
Thank you. So in January, Angelo is coming to teach 4 classes for us in our Evolve community. So I just want to talk a little bit about that now, Angelo, because it just seems, we started off with speaking to the hypothetical person who's never heard anything about this, all the way through to to is there an end?
Mm-hmm.
So the classes Angelo will be teaching are called the 4 major movements on the awakening journey. So can you say a bit about A, why you picked that particular topic, and B, what you're going to be touching on in these classes, and what people might expect if they come and join us?
Sure. Um, to be honest, I don't remember exactly why I chose that particular topic. But I do really like to talk about the fact that this does occur in stages. It does unfold in stages. There's a lot of crossover. It doesn't always happen the same for everybody, but I think it's a bit of a mistake to suggest that it doesn't, because it really does. Also, the way I broke these stages down is in a little bit different way than I have in the past, but um, it's really lending itself to pointing out the pitfalls along the way, as well as the important insights with each stage. And actually, we've been talking about it a lot in the last hour. We actually touched on so much of this, which is wonderful, traversing the shadow and so forth. And each phase leads itself into the next one, pretty fluidly, and there's overlap, of course, but the insights usually at one stage, and recognizing the pitfalls that come with that stage, and sort of seeing through those or addressing anything you need to in yourself to move beyond that, is usually what allows you to progress to the next stage, generally speaking. And I also kind of broke it down in a way that shows people that it's not like you get a little bit of enlightenment at one stage and you get a little bit more at another stage, and then you're a little more blissed out and a little more enlightened, and then really enlightened. That's not how this goes. It's just not like that. It's very nonlinear. One of the major stages that I've broken out is actually pretty gritty work. It doesn't feel like enlightenment. It doesn't feel like a stage of enlightenment or something like that. It feels like a very, very personal exploration and a gritty kind of process, but it's a critically important process. And as we talked about earlier, it's probably the most overlooked, most misunderstood, and potentially biggest pitfall for all of spirituality, and in particular, any person going through it. So I kind of broke it down that way, but it does go from, the recognition, meaning the first real taste of something beyond my normal bandwidth of experience, that tells me there is something beyond. There is something beyond the usual ways I've been thinking about life, or I've been taught to understand life and myself. That taste, and we'll talk about how you get the taste, how you can approach that, and the pitfalls around it, and then we'll talk about identity as consciousness is essentially a first awakening, and then the implications of that awakening going forward, which it does go forward through the rest of the process, and the potential pitfalls around that, because now we're starting to engage identity at a deeper level. Then the shadow work, the traversing the shadow, as we talked about, it has a very different feel than the first part of this. Very different, very visceral, very direct, very sometimes gritty. It's very personal. It has a different set of rules in a sense of how to navigate it well. And then when we start to move beyond the shadow, or often while we're still in the shadow to some degree, we start to find these very, very subtle perceptual filters that construct our identity and construct reality in such a way that it even allows us to experience ourselves as a false self. And so we're kind of getting at almost the fabric of reality. And these are very important, but they're very subtle and often overlooked. So that's the kind of last stage I'll talk about.
Great. Looking forward to that very much. Yeah, thank you. So I think I've already had three final questions, but a final question. So you've mentioned the phrase "a first awakening" a couple of times.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the difference between awakening and liberation in your view?
Yeah, to me, awakening is that first shift in identity. Big shift, big deal, very transformative. The most transformative thing that'll ever happen to you in your life, really. When you consider the contrast of how you feel before and after, and all. But it's really that's the wide opening of the true spiritual path, let's say. And then there's a lot of stuff that comes after that. And at the sort of end of the journey for the person, the journey for the individual person, that does come to an end, as I mentioned earlier. You could call being liberated from the fundamental illusions liberation. Another way of saying that is to be liberated from your own personal suffering. So the suffering of the individual ends, essentially, in my experience. And that would be liberation. You're liberated from suffering. I could say it a lot of different ways, but ultimately that's what it is. But you're liberated from the fundamental illusions that bind us into a sense of false, separate self, struggling self, suffering self. Those are dispelled. And with that usually comes, usually shortly after, comes the dropping away of the sense of suffering.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Your book is called Awake, It's Your Turn. So choosing a title like that, you obviously feel that it's available for everybody.
100%. Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's a good place to end, I think. That this
Wonderful.
Is available for everybody.
It is. Yeah, it's in everybody's capability for sure. It doesn't mean you should. Don't let me should you. It's up to you, and your instinct will know when it's time. And it may not be right now, but it may be in 5 years. You never know. But it's available to everyone for sure.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Angelo. It's been lovely talking to you.
You're so welcome. It was wonderful talking to you as well.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for listening to the Awareness Podcast in 2023. Bye bye.